My name is Ben Herscovitch and I'm a research fellow at the Center for Independent Studies. I've got the pleasure of being joined at Consilium by Patrick Chovanec, who is the Managing Director and Chief Strategist at Silvercrest Asset Management and an adjunct professor at Columbia University in the United States. In Australia and in the United States and elsewhere in the developed world, we have this constant conversation about the dangers of China's unbalanced model of economic growth, massive amounts of investment in fixed assets and low levels of domestic consumption. And the CCP is obviously aware of the need to rebalance the economy, but to what extent do you think that Xi Jinping and Li Keqiang have the political capital necessary to push through with this really contentious process of rebalancing the economy?
Well, they're aware of it, and they've been talking about it for some time. Even Premier Wen, who's no longer in office, talked about the imbalances and the importance of addressing them. But there's a big difference between talking about it and doing something about it. The existing patterns of growth are, in some ways, very comfortable. And I think if they could extend them out indefinitely, they would. What has changed is that really the model has passed its sell-by date, and you're getting, even after injecting more and more money into the Chinese economy, there's less and less growth being produced out of that. So they're really facing crunch time where they have to start making some changes, or those changes will happen to the Chinese economy. Last November, they had the party congress, and they announced a whole series of reforms, which, at least on paper, all moved in the right direction. But since then, we've seen very little sign of implementation. Now, there's some different interpretations about why this is the case. The first is that, they are going to implement these reforms, but they have to consolidate power first, and so they have to do a shakeout and get their own people in position, and then once Xi Jinping is clearly in charge, then he will move forward like a steamroller and these things will happen. But there's also simply the possibility that what looks good on paper isn't so appetizing in reality. And the question of whether they're really willing to accept game-changing reforms that not just challenge entrenched interests, but also mean slower growth in the short run. So, a lot of those reforms that they outlined would actually translate into slower growth because it would turn off the taps for the investment boom, which is not the kind of growth that you want, and they say it's imbalanced growth, but turning your back on that is challenging. And they keep on saying, yes, we're going to push through these reforms, but also we're going to have 7.5% GDP growth, and we're not going to allow the economy to fall below that. Well, when they announced that in March at the National People's Congress, I said, well, that puts a restriction on, it puts a real barrier in the face of any kind of game-changing reform, because that means that the moment that you actually try to implement reform, the moment that growth starts to slow, you're going to move in and you're going to prop it up again with the same old, go back to the trough of investment-driven growth, go back to open up the credit lines again, and it's going to set you right back where you were. I think they recognize that they're kicking the can down a one-way alley. And there's no exit from that alley, but there's the temptation to keep kicking it down the alley. So there's a disconnect between, I think, where they know they need to go. Even the most recent stimulus, they almost sound apologetic about it. They're like, well, it's only a mini stimulus, and we'll really we won't do the same bad things that we did before. It's interesting that they feel apologetic about it because they know it's not the right direction, but they still can't help themselves.
Do you think this is a case of waiting to have the political capital consolidated via the anti-corruption drive? So perhaps they're talking the talk on reform, but it'll be another couple of years before those reforms seriously hit the ground because they want to do away with certain political opponents before pushing forward with this fairly risky and dangerous reform process? Well,
that's possible, but I think there are a couple things that doesn't fully appreciate. The first is that time is running out. That we're already seeing the Chinese economy slow down. We're already seeing the investment boom buckle under its own weight. We're already seeing evidence of mounting bad debt and defaults on that bad debt. So I don't think they have 2 or 3 years to sort of figure it out about what they want to do. They need to act now. In fact, they really needed to start acting back in 2010. And they're already behind the 8 ball on that. The other thing is that it assumes that, okay, so Xi consolidates all this power, and he shows, in his statements and in his actions, he shows this sort of really strong centralizing instinct that we're going to consolidate all the power under the current Politburo Standing Committee and under Xi, and particularly under Xi, because he really hasn't delegated that much. And at the same time, what that's going to do is it's going to lay the foundation for reforms that then are all about giving up control and giving up power. Because really, the kind of game-changing market reforms and making the Chinese economy responsive to the market means giving up control over immediate outcomes. And so I think there's a contradiction between, on the one hand, this kind of centralizing, controlling instinct that Xi has been exerting, and then reform, which is really about giving up control over the allocation, where capital is allocated, what the price of capital is, for instance, in financial reform, and allowing market outcomes to actually dictate events. I don't know whether it's something that they're comfortable with. We'll have to find out. I mean, maybe he can square that circle. Maybe he fully intends to square that circle, but I haven't seen any evidence so far that that's a circle that can be squared.
Just lastly, because of all of those political barriers to wide-ranging economic reform, do you think they might try and use social policy reforms as a backdoor route to a rebalancing of the economy? Say, for example, the recent tentative steps towards more land privatization in farmland areas and the movement towards more population mobility towards larger urban areas, so the dismantling of the household registration system. Do you think that could stimulate more domestic consumption and, in a sense, produce a de facto rebalancing of the economy away from the investment-led model?
Well, possibly. But first of all, they've been talking about a lot of these things for a long time. So household registration or hukou reform has been, for the past 10 years, every time they have a party congress or a political get-together, that's on the table. And yet, it seems like it's like Groundhog Day. We're always having the same discussion. So there needs to be actually some forward progress on those things. And also, I'd say that, yes, those things and other reforms, they've got a full plate of reforms. A lot of things have piled up that could have been dealt with maybe over the course of the past 10 years. They weren't dealt with over the past 10 years. There was a lot of drift when it came to implementing reform. And so now they're playing catch up. And now they have to do social reform, including hukou and agriculture and land reform and things like that, at the same time that they can't avoid reforming the financial system, the exchange rate, state-owned enterprises, et cetera. So I don't think there's any avoiding the fact that there are a whole host of structural reforms that all need to be done at once, and they all need to be done urgently because they've been put off for a while.
It's a terrifying prospect. I'm glad I'm not in that position. Thank you very much for joining us at Consilium. It was a pleasure.
Good to be with you.